Welcome to Faith Formation Live. My name is Joseph Novak, and I am one of the pastors here at First Pres. Thank you for bearing with us. We have had just a little bit of behind-the-scenes technical issues, and we are glad to have overcome them to be together for this conversation about Scripture. With me, as always, is today the eminent preacher himself, Paul Q. Iterock. No, Paul J. Iterock.
Paul J. Yeah.
Paul J.
Trying to think what Q might be.
No. Okay. Paul, today we have two readings that we heard today. We actually heard Psalm 22, the end of Psalm 22, and we heard from Mark chapter 8. And let's start with Psalm 22. Now, this is the last half of the psalm.
Right.
What our readers don't get is the very first verse, which I think most people would recognize as something that's familiar. My God, why have you forsaken me? Because they remember that was something that Christ said from the cross. But this is the end of it, and this does not seem nearly as downer as the first part.
No, not at all. It's a transition that's taken place. I'm just trying to remember the Aramaic.
Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani?
Yeah. That's what.
Yeah, you got it. You remember.
Nice. Yeah. No, this is a big shift has taken place
Yeah.
in the psalm, and often that happens with songs of lament or songs of troubles, where there's a shift that takes place, where it's like, but I will continue to put my trust in you.
Yes.
And so
I think I heard this, and I have to go back and double check the count, but I think that roughly 1/3 of the Psalms are laments, and of them, all but 2 end with hope.
yeah,
I think there's only 2 that do not.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, even thinking the book of Lamentations, I mean, there's a desolation and pain and suffering, but right sandwiched in the center
Yeah.
is this hope-filled peace, which,
Yeah.
okay.
So one of the things I said last week, I think, is also true in this text as well. I think one of the helpful interpretive strategies for reading some of the Psalms is to imagine Christ saying these words or speaking these words. And this one is we're assisted by the later gospel readings because Jesus, in fact, is very familiar with Psalm 22. He's going to quote it on the cross, the first part. And there's one scholar who makes a really, really compelling case that anytime you see the first line of a psalm in an ancient text, like a gospel, for example, that the reader should understand and should fill in the rest of the psalm and not just leave it at that first line. So it's almost like the way in which our hymnal titles hymns by the first words of the hymn, right? So today we sang a song, Be Still My Soul, and we know that that's the first words of the first verse.
And immediately, many of the other words come to mind.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. You think of the rest of the words. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound, right? That's the name in our hymnal, right? And you fill in the rest of it kind of on your own. You recognize. If I said, I love amazing grace, you would assume that I mean I love all of amazing grace, and not just the first 2 words, amazing grace.
Right.
So similar here, Christ starts off Psalm 22 on the cross, and I find it even more compelling to think about Jesus meaning all of this. Jesus chanting Psalm 22 from the cross changes Christ on the cross from being just a, where is my Father, right? Which is how often we imagine Jesus crying out in death, to one singing a song of assurance that begins in desolation and ends with promises like, to him indeed, think about this, Jesus on the cross, to him indeed shall all who sleep in the earth bow down before him, who go down to the dust, and I shall live for him. I mean, there is a confidence that comes in knowing how the whole psalm is shaped, and Christ speaking that into being even while he offers up his spirit to the Lord.
Yeah, so there's even that final line on the cross, into your hands I commend my spirit.
Yes.
Right? There's this not a cry of kind of dereliction or hopelessness, but a cry of you have shown yourself faithful. You have made your way known. I know the history. I know your history with your creation and with your people, and I am entrusting myself to you.
Yes.
So I can't explain it.
Right. That's right.
But okay, here I am. And in that verse 25, from you come my praise in the great congregation. My vows I will pay before those who fear him. It's like, I will be vindicated, essentially, is what that, on the cross anyway, what seems to be saying. I know God is faithful. God is faithful. And I'll be praying those vows soon enough, is the trust.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So that's Psalm 22. Let's talk about the gospel reading today. I had high hopes during the children's sermon today of talking about the beans representing us and going into the coffee grinder as giving up their life for the sake of the gospel, and then, of course, being not taken in their ground up state and turned into something, that's delicious and for the sake of the world. I mean, okay, fine. But
sometimes children's
But sometimes you go a different direction, and then you realize, okay, this is a little bit too abstract. The kids are like, am I going in the grinder? It's like, no.
Is it a burr grinder?
Yeah, Jesus is like, no blade grinders, please. So Jesus began to teach them, and here them is the disciples. Yeah. And the context that immediately follows, that precedes this, is
crucial.
That's right.
Yeah.
Peter acknowledging Jesus' identity. You are the Christ.
Right.
Right?
Here's what everybody's saying. Mm-hmm. Some are saying this, some are saying this,
yes.
Some are saying that. And Jesus said, but you, who do you say that I am?
Yes.
And Peter, I think speaking for all of them.
Now
says,
in Mark, I don't have my Bible with me.
Yeah.
Does Mark include you are the Christ, the Son of God?
No, you are the Messiah, the Christ.
You are the Messiah, the Christ.
Yeah, it's a either or. So there's different authorities say different things. Yeah.
Okay, so Jesus is going to, what I imagine is the disciples have been so enculturated in a particular sense about who Messiah was and what Messiah was going to do that they're willing to accept Jesus in this role, right?
Oh, you got 8 chapters of living into the role
That's
of
exactly
the
right.
expectation. It's like, whoa, yeah. Aside from the resistance, I suppose, from leaders,
Yeah.
really, or from townspeople who knew better.
That's right. And I guess I would even put it under I think resistance, reluctance.
Yeah.
I mean, like this isn't really what we were thinking.
Oh.
Yeah.
Or waiting to see.
Yeah.
We've seen these ones come and go before.
That's right.
We've had miracle workers.
That's right.
We've seen people raise up the crowds and stir up trouble, and it leads to nothing but trouble.
Yeah.
And it's like,
there's a cynicism. It's a jaded sort of political cynicism, right? That's like, we know how this ends.
Yep.
It's not going to be good. I think it's important to point out to some of our listeners today that not every Jewish person living in the first century was looking for Messiah. No. It was not a common shared assumption. Some did, some did not. Some read Old Testament texts through the lens of messianic prophecy, and many did not. It was not something where it's like if you grabbed an average Jewish man or woman and said, are you waiting for Messiah? Some might say, no. Or some might say, I think that's not exactly, that's not, that person over there does, or that group over there does, but that's not. So part of it was easy to understand that even this affirmation of the disciples that you are the Messiah is rooted in not a shared universal language that everyone is going to be expecting. So not everyone is waiting for Jesus to fulfill any sort of prophecy from the Old Testament. But here Jesus is going to take their confession and he's going to sort of footnote it, right? Like, okay, yes, but read these notes also, right? Like,
that's right.
Messiah is going to undergo great suffering, be rejected by every person in religious leadership, right? Every category, at least, not every person, every category. Elders, chief priests, scribes. Right. Also, is going to die, and then after 3 days, rise again. And I liked verse 32. He said all this quite openly. Like, he's not hiding.
Nope, nothing secret here.
And Peter is going to pick up the mantle of the tempter from last week and is going to now proceed to test Jesus again, right? Yeah. He began to rebuke him.
Yeah, he doesn't do that openly. So there's a little twist right there. Jesus says all this openly, and Peter said, come here, and let's talk.
Yes.
Okay, I just need to set you straight.
Right.
You've got this a little bit wrong.
Right. And you can
No, you have this a
imagine
lot.
if you've been in a family gathering where you have a extended family member who has some very strong, outlandish political views, and they just start like mouthing off about, openly talking about, and you kind of get their spouse to pull them aside and say like, no, you gotta knock it off. This is Thanksgiving. We don't want
That's right.
We don't want to talk about this, right? So Peter pulls Jesus aside and is like, Jesus, we're all having a good time.
We're all having a good time, man. Look what's happening.
Knock it off.
The crowds are crazy. It's like, this is great.
Yeah, and I think, though we don't get the language of Peter's rebuke here, or Peter rebuked Jesus, which I think is just bold.
I love that.
But we don't get the language here. Maybe in other Gospels, I think Peter says, "Forbid it, Lord." Like, there's a denial of Jesus' death.
Yeah, that's not going to happen to Messiah.
Yeah, that's right.
Is what he's saying.
Yeah. And so I think Jesus interprets that to be the tempter taking on basically inhabiting Peter's mouth.
Sure.
And urging him to consider a way towards messiahship that doesn't involve the cross. Mm-hmm. And that had to be a tempting notion. Like, maybe there's a way, maybe these crowds, maybe it won't be betrayal and death, and maybe it will just be the slow change and transform of this crowd into God's kingdom, and death won't need to be necessary.
Yeah. There's sometimes we want to put Jesus up and say, well, he never would have thought that. He was ready. He said, I'm anxious to die in some way because I know what's going to happen. It's like, well, to do that and to say that and to believe that denies the humanity of Jesus.
Yes.
To say, no, Jesus, fully human, loathed the thought of dying.
Yes.
He had no desire to be beaten and bruised and bloodied,
yes.
to be crucified, tormented, and disgraced and humiliated. That was not something he relished, nor would you or I, any other human being. It's like, no, this is not. So the temptation, I think, is like, look what's been happening these past, however long it's been, but these past 8 chapters.
That's right.
It's like, man, this is good. Mm-hmm. This is good. Mm-hmm. And besides, Mark at the very beginning said, this is the good news of me, the Son of God, the Christ, Jesus Christ. So
that's right. Jesus is going to, so it starts with Jesus saying this quite openly. Peter takes him aside one-on-one. Jesus turns and looks at his disciples, and then he, still one-on-one, rebukes Peter. Then he called the crowd with his disciples. Now he's back to the open. So you get this sort of like openness, narrow, back to the openness, right? And Jesus essentially connects what he is about to go through with the normative life of discipleship. Right. So it's like, listen, not only am I going to suffer and be killed, but you need to expect that this is the normal course of your life.
That's right.
Right? That if anyone wanted to be my followers, let them deny them, take up their cross and follow me. Right? I think sometimes we put the emphasis on cross there or on follow me, but I think the emphasis might be helpfully placed on there. And Jesus reminding everyone that, no, the call of discipleship is to pick up your cross. Right? And to recognize that you are carrying around with you always the instrument upon which you might be killed.
Sure.
Right? That there's some sort of, the testimony about Christ, the witness of Christ in our world is one that often comes, we assume that, like, who wouldn't love Jesus's meekness and humility and love and, but then we find out exactly who doesn't love those things. Like, it's anyone who is threatened by that because it imperils our selfishness, our greediness. It imperils empires and nations. It imperils religious establishments who build whole empires in the backs of the poor. And all of this Jesus calls into question. And it's Jesus, if you're going to do this, if you're going to follow me, then you need to recognize that, like, your life might be demanded of you.
If it's demanded of me and I'm the follower, then you can expect it's going to be demanded of you at some point.
Yeah.
And that's also not in some big way. I remember growing up and always wondering, the question would be posed, what will you do if, the government comes and...
No, but think about like Columbine. That was like a big question in my generation of just like, okay, gunman comes in with a gun and threatens to kill you if you say you believe in Jesus. What would you say?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so sometimes we put this into those giant questions like that is
Yes.
just beyond remarkable. And it's like, okay, I can imagine I'm going to stand up and I'm going to do the right thing.
Yeah.
But taking up your cross is also in the mundane of living.
Yes.
It's when I wake up in the morning because my kid is banging the drum louder than he should. And it's like, how am I going to react? How am I going to respond? What am I going to do with this, okay?
Yeah.
And I'm speaking of Jacob, my 19-year-old Jacob. No, it's what are you going to do when you're in a bad, cranky mood?
Yes.
And your spouse snaps at you. It's like, how am I going to respond? What am I going to do? It's like, wait, I cannot fall into that temptation to fight fire with fire, or to whatever, to bite back, to snap back in a way in order to justify myself. But yeah.
Well, and I'll say this last thing because I just saw the timer go off. But, the cross is, for Christ, the ultimate, disciplining instrument in his life. He knows that it looms large over. He knows there's only one outcome for people who would be thought to be seditious or blasphemous, right? And that's going to be a cross.
Yep.
And it's designed to be shameful. It's designed to be in your face. It's designed to make people never want to do whatever it is that got that person up there, right? And in some ways, for Jesus, that is going to discipline everything. He is going to know, he knows that the things he's saying and doing are leading towards that end. And I think part of it is to pick up your cross. This is what you're suggesting as well. To pick up your cross and follow him is to pick up the object, the thing that disciplines all of our life, and I think Jesus is commending, that sort of just as he carried the cross through the city streets out to Calvary, right? Just as he was passing by normal, it wasn't. It's one thing to be killed on the cross. It's another thing to carry the cross, right? To drag it around with you your whole life, right? And to recognize that there is a. I mean, St. Paul says this in 2 Corinthians, for we carry with us the death of Christ, like the body of Christ in our death, right? So that we can carry the resurrection of Christ in our life. There's something about, I don't know, carrying our I don't know how I would explain it there, but Jesus.
You brought to mind the guy who spent his life dragging a cross around the country. Do you remember that guy?
Oh, I
do
remember
his
that guy.
Name. It's here somewhere. The little man's running, trying to find it.
No, that's fine. So let's leave it there today. And next week we'll pick up with, I think we go to the Gospel of John for a couple weeks, and we hear about the cleansing of the temple. So we'll have some more conversation next week about the life, sort of Jesus' Lenten journey and our Lenten journey. So go in peace this week. Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll look forward to welcoming you back to Daily Prayer